Welcome to Beyond the Bar, the podcast where coffee and conversation are a catalyst for growth. If you've been searching for that coffee with a friend experience that leaves you feeling seen, met, and encouraged, you've come to the right place. So grab your cup, listen up, and together we're going beyond the bar.
Hi friends, welcome to Beyond the Bar. I'm your host, Abby. I'm so looking forward to today's episode. It's a little bit different than what we've done before, but this is going to be a two-part mini-series in preparation for Father's Day. So we're calling this Legacy Builders. This is part one, and I'm really looking forward to sitting down and introducing you guys to one of my friends, Matthew Johnson.
Thanks, Abby. It's great to be here.
Thank you. I appreciate you being here. We've had a lot of conversations actually just around your dinner table. So
Yes.
It is fun to bring that beyond the dinner table now to other people. And I feel like you are going to be a perfect person to dive into today's topic. So I appreciate it.
Thank you.
To start, maybe you could just explain a little bit about your background, who you are, where you came from.
Sounds good. So I like to start out by saying I'm a Christian. I've been saved for 30 years. I was just thinking about this the other day, that makes me feel old. So I've been saved for 30 years. I was saved at a young age of 15, and just so grateful that God was so gracious to me in my youth. Gave me a great family. I grew up in a great family, a Christian home. Had great role models in my dad, in my mom. And so I feel like, as the psalmist would have said, the lines have fallen unto me in good places. So that's first and foremost. Second, been married for 20 years, or coming up on 20 years the next few days.
Congratulations.
Yes. So married to just a wonderful woman. She's more than the better half of me. And together, we've gone through a lot of the ups and downs of life, like everybody else goes through, whether it's illness or just hard times. But through it all, God's been so gracious in our marriage, giving us grace to live each day together and for Him. And then been a dad for 18 years. So this is kind of a new one. Our firstborn is graduating and looking at life, and that's also making me feel old. So, but we have 4 kids, 2 boys and 2 girls. Just can't imagine life without them at this point. Just the whole dynamic of family, and it hasn't always been easy, of course. But it's been very rewarding. It's been very fulfilling. And then more recently, became an elder in a church here in Sarona. And I've been doing that for a little while now, kind of touching on where I came from ministry-wise. I have been in ministry in pastoral roles in one form or another for 11 years. And so whether it's pastoring, assistant pastoring, lead pastoring, all of that has kind of been interspersed with also some business, starting with business, then into ministry, then back into business, and now kind of focusing more on ministry again.
And I've, again, lucky enough to know your family, have gotten to been around them, been around your dinner table, but you actually started in business and in kind of a crazy, bold way. Could we get into that a little bit?
Sure. So a friend of mine and I, we met when we were 15 through a homeschool group gathering of sorts. And just kind of hit it off. And we were curious minds, always thinking up, trying to invent something. So when I was 20, so graduated age 20, we thought to ourselves, well, we're young enough. Let's start a business. If it doesn't work, we don't have anybody that we're committed to. We're not married. We don't have any kids. And we have the rest of our lives to recoup. So we thought, let's do that. We also to take it a little bit deeper than that, we really sensed that, hey, this is what the Lord wants us to do. I had applied for and been accepted into the industrial engineering program at NDSU in Fargo, North Dakota, and was planning on becoming an industrial engineer. Grew up on a farm and just had spent a lot of time looking at things on how to make them better. And it would frustrate me that it wasn't better. And I grew up playing with Legos, putting stuff together. And so I wanted to get involved in putting systems together and ways to make things better and create an environment for people in a business that would truly be a great place for people to work. And so at the age of 20, we we just quit our jobs. Like, I wouldn't say do it that way necessarily again. But we were just so sure that we were on the right track. And so we quit our jobs. We didn't even know what we were going to do. So we spent the first month trying to figure out, what are we going to do?
Yeah.
And so that's kind of how it started. In an apartment with a folding table and 2 wooden chairs and a couple legal pads.
I love that. And eventually you did figure out an idea and go into business. And then you eventually got married, which wasn't like too long in that process, right?
So getting married, I think that was about 5 years into the process.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I was 20 when we started the business. I met my to-be wife when I was 25.
Okay.
And so, but the business, of course, we started out really humble. We didn't have money. We didn't come from money. And so you had to be very creative and you had to be very sacrificial. I know what it's like to flavor noodles for weeks on end and live that life.
Yeah.
But we got through those first few years and the business was starting to finally eke out a bit of a living for us when I met my wife. And so it wasn't by any means a safe thing at that point. It wasn't like, oh, this is in the bag and there's nothing to worry about.
Yeah.
There was still a lot of unknowns. There was still a lot of pinching yet to come.
Yeah.
So
how did you decide then that it was the right, you met your wife or she was going to become your wife. Business is okay, but you're still in those hard years. You're grinding, you're figuring out. How did you decide that it was okay and the right time to pursue getting married, having a family, and doing that while being, kind of the risky entrepreneur lifestyle?
Yeah. First of all, it was being very honest with her. Like, this is how this could go.
Yeah.
And I think the second thing was we were so in love. I don't know if we would have, reality didn't play as much of a role as it could have or should have maybe. But it was just being brutally honest about, hey, here's how this can go. It's not like we were 6 months into it. We were a few years into it.
Yeah.
And at some point it was a little bit of a leap of faith. But at the same time, it's the next stage of life and that needs to get going.
Yeah.
And so it definitely brought another level of seriousness to what I was doing in the business.
Yeah.
As opposed to just like, oh, if this doesn't work out, I can recover. And well, no, it has to work out.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, yeah.
So how soon after you guys got married, you're doing entrepreneurship life, she joins the partnership in that sense, coming on board. How soon after that did you guys start a family and you add dad to the list of roles?
Well, we had this great idea that we were going to wait a few years before we had children. And like we had it all planned out. And I don't know, we weren't married but 2 months. And we found out that we were going to have our first.
Oh.
And so that didn't go as planned.
Yeah.
So we thought, well, we're going to make this work. And the Lord knows about this. And so we kind of, we committed to the just trusting the Lord through that phase. And we ended up miscarrying that first one. And so, but what that did is it really did kind of position our mindset for a family early.
Yeah.
If that hadn't happened, we probably would have waited, for our ultimate dream to play out. But in the end, this was probably better than what we had dreamed anyway. It just, we didn't see it at the time. It's not what we'd have chosen, but the Lord knew better.
Yeah.
And so I wouldn't change it at this point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So when you actually got your firstborn in your arms, how was that transition from, like, you're doing I know the entrepreneurship hustle. It's weird hours. You're working insane. You're looking at numbers. You're praying it works, and you're taking risk on the future. So how did you balance that? And then now this new role where it's like, I have to provide for this family and like make sure there's a roof over their heads and we've got food on the table.
Yeah, it was exhausting. I'm not gonna lie about that or sugarcoat it. It was exhausting. But at the same time, I was a lot younger, and there was the energy there along with God's grace. Yeah. And so, but it was not easy. It was, I'm holding this precious life in my arms, and there's my wife, and like at the same time going through my head is, where's the next paycheck coming from? And how are we going to pay for this? And it's a struggle of life. It's the day in and day out. Now, entrepreneurship will add definitely a whole nother layer to that.
Yeah.
No doubt about it. But again, I kind of went back to the comfort that, okay, I'm doing the right thing. I'm in the right spot. I started down the path that I believe God wanted me on. And so I have to trust him.
Yeah.
I have to trust him through this, for this, beyond this.
Yeah.
And so that was a big part of giving the energy and the wherewithal to be able to keep going and be able to do it.
Yeah. I feel like even if you're not an entrepreneur, that is so relatable. Having responsibilities, having bills pile up, seeing the numbers come in and then going, how in the world am I going to bear that responsibility?
Yeah.
Do you have any advice to anybody who is in a similar position?
I would say you're going to have to really put yourself last and put others first as a starter. You're going to have to think about the needs of those around you and your own kind of wish list, desires, wants. That's just going to have to be put on the back burner. And that's the thing about that's owning responsibility. That's just rolling up the sleeves and denying self, and doing it for the sake of others. But in that, at the same time, comes an amazing fulfillment that is above and beyond better than what ends up looking like superficial things on the wish list. And so there's fulfillment. There's also a sense of satisfaction. I don't know that, but that comes any other way. And that is your focus is on others.
Yeah. And
your life is now gone from serving kind of yourself to serving others. And it's in that act of serving others and being in that role as a servant that you really start to find, wow, life is big. There's some worthy endeavors here. And it's far more rewarding than what ends up looking like the superficial things on the list.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's such good advice. I think it's counter to what you see in the world a lot. Everyone's looking at, the brands you're wearing and how nice your house is and how cute your kids are dressed, or the family vacation you're taking or not. And in a world of social media and likes and a lot of that kind of superficial stuff that you're talking about, I think it's really hard to have that perspective that, okay, put my head down and what does it look like to serve the people around me, particularly when you're talking like a family and as a husband and a father, your kind of responsibility to make it work.
Mm-hmm. I would also add um, a very big ingredient to this whole formula, and that is I had a wife who was right there alongside of me. So she's the queen of finding deals. I don't know how she does it. She just has this thing where she can walk in and she can to a store or a thrift store and she can just find that one thing that we need. And what I learned through that process, I'm kind of the opposite. I'm like, I need this. I go buy this. End of story. I don't think about it. Right.
Yeah.
That doesn't always work, especially in the situations we're talking about.
Yeah.
And so what it taught me was to get my focus off of the superficial, the brand that I'm sporting or the newness of something and the price tag that goes with that.
Yeah.
And you really get down to practical living. And I think in part, it's one of the great things about family life and marriage in general is it makes us practical rather than superficial and almost unrelatable to real life.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. I like that a lot. So you guys were doing family life, you're doing entrepreneurship, but that's not where you stayed, which you alluded to earlier.
Yes.
So at some point, things started kind of changing for you. Could we talk about that season a little bit?
Absolutely. So, shortly after I met my wife, I surrendered to the call to preach and to pastor, go into ministry. That was not something that I necessarily had in my mind from a young age of any kind. And I'd been in the business at that point for roughly 5 years, and things were going well at that point. It wasn't like, well, this isn't doing so hot, so let's try the next thing.
Yeah.
It wasn't that at all. The business was doing well, and we were beyond just the macaroni and cheese stage now.
Yeah.
And so, but what began to happen in my heart is the desire that I had for business and some of the reasons I had started it began to not shine as bright. There was nothing wrong with the business and the partnership was great, but at the same time, the Lord began changing my desires. And so I was a little bit confused by that at first. I was like, where is this coming from? Why am I feeling this way? I have what most people by the age of 25 would love to have.
Yeah.
Why am I thinking these thoughts about ministry? And I couldn't figure it out. So I got some counsel. I went and talked to older men in my life. And I would say that was very important. It was very, very critical to get outside your own head in a sense and draw on practical wisdom from people who've been around life. Maybe they haven't started businesses, but they've lived life long enough to know some things and recognize some things. And so began to talk with some older men in my life, and these desires grew and grew stronger and stronger, to the point where one particular Sunday morning, I was in church and the pastor was preaching on Simon of Cyrene carrying the cross for Christ because he had fallen beneath the load, and the Lord just made it very clear to me, like, this is what I want you to do. I want you to bear the cross of ministry and preaching. And I said, okay. you'll have to help me,
Yeah.
but I'm willing. And so that began a long process.
Mm-hmm.
And from there, of course, I thought, how is Rose gonna handle this? Like,
Yeah.
I haven't met her that long, and so I called her up and told her, and she was like, well, in so many words, she had expected that that's who she would end up marrying one day, would be a pastor. And I did not know that.
Yeah.
So what was going to be, I thought in my mind, a very scary phone call turned out to be like, oh, all right, well, this is good. And given where I was at in my stage in life, 25, 26, right in there, and deeply entrenched in the business. It's not like I could just up and leave and go to Bible school and that. So after, again, kind of discussing this with some of the older men in my life, and including my pastor, we decided, let's just train inside the local church. And during that process, I can slowly detach myself from the business, and we'll see how that goes. We'll see where it goes. And so for 4 years, I trained in the church. I began helping out, and my pastor at the time gave me a lot of opportunities, which I would say was very gracious of him. He gave me a lot of opportunities to put my feet in the water a little bit and see how this goes and see how this feels. And some of it was on the job training, as it were. Some of it was book learning. But at the same time, as I was doing that, I was slowly extracting myself from the business so that was in a healthy spot too.
Yeah.
For my partner. And so then after about 4 years, we got to a point where I was out of the business, or I was able to leave the business. And at that point, the church that basically I had grown up in from the age of 7 voted to take me on full-time as an assistant pastor on staff. And so that created a transition for us. Here I go from kind of the business mindset and all that's kind of in that world to the ministry mindset and all that's in that world. And they're different worlds. And so that was, I think, back in 2007, September of 2007.
Okay.
And so I served in that church for 9 years as the assistant pastor. And as those 9 years went on, I began to carry more and more of the pastoral load. And my pastor was very gracious to me to let me have the experience, to let me do a lot of preaching, preach on special occasions. And it was there that I kind of cut my teeth. And the Lord also took our family through some health situations during that time, and really as part of the training, like I didn't realize that was part of the syllabus, but we were going to have some kids and they were going to be in the hospital for a while. And then how those things softened our hearts towards the plight of other people. So there was a lot that happened in that 9 years. And then from there, we took a church down in Missouri, where I was the associate pastor for a year, and then was voted as the lead pastor. And I was a lead pastor there for a year, so 2 years down there, so a total of 11 overall.
You mentioned something which I would like to hit on and just ask you about a little bit. You said that the Lord kind of was working on your heart and softening it to pull out of business, this business you had built and was going well, and then go into ministry. And you had that moment and you're like, okay, I'm willing, I'm going to do this. But then you said it was 4 years of a waiting transition process. So could we get into that a little bit? Because I feel like waiting is not something that people talk about or is very popular, particularly in our culture right now. When we want something, we're kind of like an instant gratification. Like we want it now. If you want something, you just quit your job and you leave and you like go after something else. But that's a long transitional process into something else. From the moment you said, okay, Lord, I'm willing to that. Could we get into that?
Waiting, yes. Patience. We do live in a culture that my wife had once told me, she said, I slaved over the microwave for 7 minutes.
Mm.
And she was using it as a joke.
Yeah.
But wow, it really brought to my mind how in our culture we have come to expect. And our expectations have demands underneath of them.
Mm-hmm.
And when our expectations aren't met, and then we get demanding. And there's all kinds of variations to those demands, from being polite about it to like, I want this now.
Yeah.
And so, we expect instant communication. Why haven't you read my text? All of that.
Yeah.
It affects us. There's no way around that. We're immersed in it every day. But God isn't.
Mm.
And so, a day can be, 1,000 years can be as one day to him. And so our time frames and God's time frames, and I think as you read through the Bible, you'll find this, they don't line up.
Mm-hmm.
So it was 4 years of transitioning out and transitioning in.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't just done in 3 months. It was, the Bible talks about patience, letting patience have her perfect work in our lives. And that is so necessary to become less demanding, less expectant, more patient.
Mm-hmm.
It's easier on everybody around us, and it does glorify God.
Yeah.
So I'm not good at that. I'm a bit of a perfectionist. I'm a bit of like, why wasn't it done yesterday? And why wasn't it done perfectly yesterday?
Mm-hmm.
So those 4 years, it was messy for me. I was definitely outside of my sweet spot.
Mm-hmm.
As I'm transitioning out, I'm also transitioning outside of controlling everything. So I had built this life where I controlled everything.
Yeah.
If I didn't like it, I didn't do it. If something, I wouldn't put up with it.
Yeah. Yeah.
It just, so you can't do that in ministry. It doesn't even work well in a home.
Yeah.
Right?
Or life in general.
Life in general. Yep. So, so there was a process there where God broke that down. Now, I would say he's still doing that. So I don't know that we ever arrive, but God does work on us, and we do get better, and it's because of His grace in our lives. And so that was a hard time. And then I'm transitioning into ministry where you can't just hire and fire. I mean, you're enmeshing yourself with people's lives, and you're learning to love them. And that doesn't happen overnight either.
Yeah.
They're not perfect, and neither am I. So their lives are messy, and situations are messy, and it's not simple.
Mm-hmm.
It's not cut and dry. And that takes time to work through. And so you need patience for that. So God began a process of softening through the work of waiting and through the work of patience, to make his servant more relatable, and more of a servant and less of a boss.
And did you find that having kind of a foot in both places. Was that
was hard.
okay?
That was very hard. Because really, I had my feet in 3 places: family, business, and ministry.
Mm-hmm.
And I got to the point where I couldn't do all 3. And so, and part of the perfectionist side of me was like, okay, if I'm going to be in business, I want to do it perfectly.
Yeah.
I want to give the customer the perfect experience.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want them to get something and it not be right.
Mm-hmm.
I don't care who the customer is. If they're the first one or the 100th one or the 1,000th one, they need to have a perfect product.
Yeah.
But then ministry is this, like you're dealing with things and it takes time and you're working through things. And so those 2 things collided a lot.
Mm.
And then I go home and, there's little noses pressed up against the door and I'm worn out.
Yeah.
I'm worn out. And then there's everything at the house to deal with. Not that that's bad. There's a lot of good things, but it's the noise. Like, I'm worn out. Like, can I have like half an hour where I can just go sit in the porch and it's quiet? Stuff like that.
Yeah. Did you set any systems like that at home or boundaries at home? Did you do anything in life to help boundary those kind of things or make Matt okay?
Matt had to learn how to change.
Okay.
Because I didn't want. I'm really good at putting a system together, a process, measuring that process, the KPI. Like, I'm really good at that.
Yeah.
And I couldn't do that to my family. And so I had to change. And I had to relax. And that's a word that felt almost like anti who I am.
Yeah.
Is the word relax. But that's what I needed to do. I didn't do it as elegantly as I should have. And here's me judging myself, but I didn't do that elegantly and I didn't do it enough. And I wished I would have done it more, even if it wasn't quite elegant. I wish I would have done it more.
Yeah.
But part of that plays into a little bit of something that kind of came out in ministry in general later on. And that was just even who I am and the whole concept of identity. I felt like there was performance attached to who I'm supposed to be. In the business world, it is about performance. It is about that product going out to the customer and it being perfect. That's performance. And you measure that. And you're always like, you're never content with the numbers as they were. You want them better. And there's this tendency to forget the victories as if they never happened because you're on to the next thing, like right now. And so that was hard. It was hard to realize that who Matthew Johnson is, his worth does not rest in that. His worth does not rest in the perceived success of that.
Yeah.
Who he is and his worth rests in the Lord. And we're going to make mistakes. Does that mean it's okay to make mistakes? No. Do we like the mistakes that we make? No. But at the same time, it's reality.
Yeah.
And God is gracious. He's far more gracious to me than I was to anybody else in my life. And so Matthew had to learn how to relax, and he had to change.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that is so relatable to humans in general, but I think particularly to men. I grew up with 3 younger brothers, so I'm obviously not a man, so I can't speak to men from personal experience, but growing up with brothers highly involved in athletics, and I've even seen it in my dad, just that tie for, like you said, performance to be kind of how you base yourself or what you're able to achieve. And it's kind of just this fear of competing against each other, and not that competition is necessarily bad, but just that kind of striving to like, well, I have to do the best and I have to be the best. And that can have an impact in a way emotionally that you wouldn't necessarily always see. So it's cool that the Lord was working on it there.
Yes, absolutely. There is a sense in which a man wants to go out and slay the dragon. He wants to go out, he wants to slay that thing and come home victorious, right? But at the same time, the dragon you don't always kill the dragon. And so who you are is not dependent. Your worth is not dependent on how well you slayed the dragon. Now, it's good to have that in front of you.
Yeah.
But not mixing up your identity with your performance is huge.
Yeah. Well, I can relate to that even just as a woman. Just being someone who's a high achieving person who has goals, being in business now myself, it's really easy to go like, yeah, my worth is tied in that. And if it fails, what does that say about me?
Absolutely.
So being able to separate those two things, that my worth is secure, even if my performance fails, is life-giving because it allows you to fully run in something, but then not lose who you are in the process, which I think is necessary for business. It's necessary for life because like you said, we're all going to fail. We're all going to have those moments where you fall on your face. I definitely have. And if it hasn't been for, like you said, learning how to separate those two things, you wouldn't get back up again.
Yeah, absolutely.
So you transitioned into ministry full time. You were doing ministry in Missouri. Could we talk about Missouri a little bit and what that was like? That was kind of your like last stop in, or where we last ended in kind of your journey.
Yes. So Missouri was kind of the graduate class, if I can say it that way, for this work that God was doing in my life as it relates to identity. And in the one sense, like we've talked about, transitioning out of business into ministry, not basing your identity on your performance, that was level 101. But at this point, I'm in ministry now. I'm out of the business, and I'm enjoying ministry. It's grueling at times. There's hard cases. And if you're not careful, it can really weigh on you. Other people's situations can really weigh on you. But I'm doing it.
Yeah.
And so we moved down to Missouri. I take a church there. And things are going great. I'm the associate pastor. I went down there, and the church and it was with the agreement or the understanding that I would become the pastor, and the previous one would retire, or the one then would retire.
Yeah.
And so the first year I served as the associate, and things went great. The church votes me on to be the senior or the lead pastor. And so I served for another year, and out of what I would say is out of the blue, as we would say, the expression, I'm not sure where it comes from, but I end up forcibly terminated. And that was the hardest thing I've gone through, because unlike being forcibly terminated from a job, there's like wrapped up in that for a pastor, if he's not careful, is a whole spiritual component to it. And so the situation was especially hard because the way in which I was forcibly terminated, forced termination, basically what that is there's a minority group of people in a church that lead basically a coup against the pastor. And though there's no moral fault, there's no dereliction of duty or anything like that, they just don't, either for whatever reason, they don't like them, or they don't like the preaching, or whatever. There's a lot of different reasons why this can happen. But they lead a coup essentially against the pastor, and they sway the church to get rid of the pastor. And so for us, this was pretty hard because we don't have any family in the area. We had left all to come and serve in this church. We had made a lot of friends in the church. We were living in the parsonage at the time. And so our lives are wrapped up in serving in that church.
Yeah.
And basically, in a Saturday afternoon, it was all over. And I remember walking across the church parking lot to the parsonage, just in shock that I remember thinking to myself, okay, I'm a pastor, but I don't have a church. And I didn't realize it at the time, but the problem with that was I thought who I was a pastor. I did not realize that I had misplaced my identity in what I do. In our culture today, we think about, when we meet somebody, we say, well, what do you do for a living? And we never really quite think of it as this is what they do for a living. We usually answer it with the idea that this is what I am. I am, a CEO, or I am an entrepreneur, or I am a pastor. I am these things. And over time, we get to believing that, unfortunately. And so here I am thinking to myself, I am a pastor. I do not have a church. They want us out in 10 days. It was very disorientating. It was, to say the least.
Yeah.
And so that began really about a 5-year process of, I would say the first 2 years of that, I was in a coma, just emotionally, spiritually. And it took that long just to realize that I never was a pastor in the sense of who I am. I am still a child of God. God did not abandon me. He did not abandon my family at that point. And so once I could get my heart and mind around that, then there was about what I would say 3 years of rehab that followed that.
Yeah.
And so those 3 years, rehab's not easy. Being in the coma is almost easier because you're out. I mean,
Yeah.
And literally during those first 2 years, I was numb. I was just numb to many things. I remember telling my wife that something died inside. And but coming out of the coma and then realizing, okay, I have to get out of the hospital bed here. And there's a family around me. There's growing children that are getting into their teen years. And so, reaching out and getting some counseling, getting some help, which I would say was very hard for me to do. Because this whole thing brought out so many things. Just even pride in the sense of, well, I'm tough. I can handle this, right?
Yeah.
No, you can't. You will need help. And so admitting that, embracing that, rehab was like, oh, I'm going to put pressure on some joints that hurt. And then we're going to take the pressure off and we're going to see how that goes. And then we're going to put pressure on it again. And then we're going to take it off, but we're going to try hold out longer this time. It's not easy.
Yeah.
And so those were the hard 3 years. And that kind of takes me to January of this year. And so, God's grace, I will say this, God's grace was sufficient during that time. Though it was not easy. So,
And you had at one point said or thought that maybe you wouldn't go to church potentially, correct?
yes.
Now you're an elder at a church, going to church, writing biblical, like Bible studies, devotionals, like very involved in in church.
Yeah.
How did you go from saying I'm never doing that again, I'm not being a part of something like that, to being like a faithful, productive member of a church?
I would say, well, there's there's quite a few things that kind of came together. First, I would say my wife got there sooner than I did. And so she was a big help along the way. When this whole thing first happened, I thought to myself, okay, I have a family I've got to provide for. I got to get them to a location of some kind. We got to get a house again. I've got to find a job. Not that ministry isn't work.
Yeah.
But when you get forcibly terminated like that, word goes out about how toxic you are at that point. And so people shun you. People who you thought were your friends in the ministry are no longer your friends. What's interesting is I never got a phone call to find out if what they had heard was true. And so there's this sense of being betrayed.
Yeah.
And so, and I knew at that point, like, I can't just jump back into another church. I don't know what happened to me. So I was thinking then, I don't know what's happened to me, but I know I can't just jump back into another church. So I got to find a job somewhere. And so that took a lot out of me just to reset the foundation again. And so once that was done, then it's like, okay, now the pain starts to set in. It's kind of like, you fall off the bike, you hit the pavement real hard. You don't feel it at first. You get up, you're looking at yourself like, did I break anything?
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden it's like, oh, my knee hurts really bad. And so it was in that moment of sheer pain that I began to think to myself, well, if this is how the Lord's church is going to treat me, is going to treat my family, I don't want anything to do with it. You have to be, obviously looking back on that, it's I wouldn't have accepted it at the time, but that's pretty proud and arrogant to say, because not all churches are the same. Now, no church is perfect, but not all churches are the same.
Yeah.
And so, but in the state of pain, you don't hear that kind of thing. Logic and reason doesn't. You're just in pain. That's all you feel.
Yeah.
And so, part of the problem too was, prior to thinking that, we got involved in another church again, and this church had found out that, well, wow, you used to be a pastor and you guys know how to do ministry and things like that. So, just get plugged right back in. And I didn't quite realize that was not the thing to do. And so literally one Sunday morning, I'm trying to put on my church clothes, as it were. And I just have a breakdown. Like, I physically cannot move. I'm done. Then COVID hit. And so the church we were attending at that time stopped having services, like a lot of other places. And it was really kind of the thing for us that allowed us to step back and really say, wow, we're in way too far at this point. We are going to have to heal first. And that's when the whole concept of healing really began to kind of come to the forefront. And like I said, my wife got there first. And I would say even my children got there before I did. And so once I remember we were going for a walk one day, and my wife was like, so I talked to this counselor today. I was just like, oh, good for you. I don't need one. In my mind, I'm like already defending myself. I don't need one, And she begins to talk about like just the things that this counselor had helped her see, and that began to slowly soften me up a little bit towards accepting the fact that I have a lot of healing that I need to do, and I'm not going to get through on my own. When you go to rehab, they don't just say, okay, here's the stretches, I'll be back in half an hour.
Yeah.
They're going to show you how to do it. They're going to help you move your arm because you don't have the strength to move your arm on your own, depending on, what your accident was.
Right.
And so so that began to just roll around in my mind like, okay, I'm going to need this. And finally, I admit, okay, who were you talking to again? Do you think you could find out if they would, talk to me, that kind of thing? And just slowly started stepping my way into that. And it was hearing that other voice on the other end of the Zoom call and seeing that other person on the other end of the Zoom call that really began to work on my mind and my heart to say, this isn't over. This is not final. This is God's at work here, and He's allowed this. Yes. Is this what you would have chosen? No. But what He's going to do through this, He wants you to be a part of it. And like that was the first glimmer of hope, where I could see that God loved me. He loved my family, and He's going to help me. And whatever this next thing is, whatever this it isn't over is, He's going to. I'm not going to have to do that alone.
Yeah.
And that's not going to define me either. And so that's kind of how I began to step out of that.
Yeah. Yeah. Our stories are not at all the same, but I can relate to that kind of that timeline you talked about. You go through something that's traumatic and you just feel, like you said, numb, in a coma, don't know how to process. Then all of a sudden you get to that stage where you go, oh, I'm feeling the broken things now. And then you almost don't even realize the depth of brokenness there because you have this kind of innate, like, I'm going to muscle through. And then as you're muscling through, you start to realize, oh, I'm maybe not as okay as I thought I was. And so getting to that level of healing, letting people in. But now you are starting to see some of those redemption pieces of your story coming into play. You're back in ministry, and you're actually starting to get into a sphere where you're telling that story to help other people. So are you starting to see the picture come together a little bit here?
Yes. So back in January, I thought, well, I'm going to read the Bible through this year. I'm going to do it chronologically. And as I started to do that, I got through the book of Genesis, Job, getting into the book of Exodus, and I thought to myself, I need to get out of my comfort zone a little bit here and start writing, journaling my thoughts, and put that out in the form of a blog. And so the very first one was very hard to do. Again, all the insecurity, did I do it good enough? All the perfectionism, like the ghosts from the past, they all start to wave their hands at me.
Yeah.
And so I began to do that, but I found that as I did it, the floodgates began to open for the desire to be back in ministry. And it was very therapeutic. It was very healing. And putting myself out there. And then as I did that, kind of in the back of my mind was in the back of my mind was the idea of taking the comfort and the healing that I've experienced and being a steward of that. It is a gift. It doesn't feel like it in the moment, but it is a gift. And God allows us to go through those things so that we don't just keep that to ourselves, but we take that comfort that He's given us and we comfort others. And so as I began to think through that, again, it's kind of like the floodgates began to open to, uh, I want to help people again. I want to love people again. I want to learn how to do that better. I want to glorify God through that. And so, kind of in the back of my mind is, how do I tell this story in the future? And how do I help others going through what we went through, see beyond the tragedy and see beyond the pain? And not that you'll come out the other end of it identical to who you were going into it. You'll come out the other end of it better, but at the same time, kind of to use the story of Jacob wrestling with God. Jacob wrestled with God all night, and it's just amazing that God even allowed Jacob to wrestle with him. I mean, it's not like God was just barely hanging on.
Yeah.
But Jacob walked away from that with a limp for the rest of his life. And it was just, you go through some of these things like this, and you heal, but you're a different person now. And how does God want to use that person? And how does God want to use the things that that person now knows and use it to help others?
Yeah.
There is, again, kind of coming back to that serving others mentality. There's another tool in the tool belt. It wasn't easy to get, but it's needful in other people's lives. And how can I be part of that?
Yeah. Yeah. And I don't think everyone goes through experiences and chooses to allow it to prove that result. And, for a while, you didn't know if you were going to either.
Yeah.
And so I think it is so encouraging as you start to tell your own story. It encourages other people to start going, I want to go through whatever my trauma is, whatever my hard season or chapters are. I don't want them to be the thing that define me forever.
Yeah.
I want it to refine me. And then I want to set out and I want to find the people who need to hear what I've been through so that they can have the hope that you're talking about finding.
Yes.
Which is so cool because you're actively doing that now, or starting to do that is putting out resources, putting out daily devotionals, which are fantastic, by the way, and doing things to be back in ministry, serving the Lord and offering hope and encouragement to people, which again, like what a redemption story, which I know is still being written, but what a cool phase that you're in with that.
Yes. Something that's kind of interesting is when I first began to write these devotions and put them out on the blog, the organization that I had reached out to, that Rose had reached out to initially for some counseling, it's an organization that they're set up and their focus is to help pastors and families go through forced termination and come out the other side of it. They actually reached out to me and asked if I would be interested in being a guest blogger for them. And at that time, I had begun to write kind of the first paragraphs, I'll say, of the story. So this is different than the devotionals, but began to write the first paragraphs of the story. And so it's just interesting to see how God's working through all of this. And so I put that together, and that'll be coming out in May on their blog. And it's brutal. It's pretty raw. But at the same time, it's filled with hope and help.
Yeah.
And so I don't know where all of this is going, other than to say there's a lot more of the story to write.
Yeah.
And I truly do hope that it does help others.
Yeah. I am such a passionate fan for telling your redemption story as it's in process. Not at the necessarily those beginning parts. I think there's a part for privacy, and there's a part for healing, and there's a part for that, and a stage for that. But then there comes this stage where you don't necessarily know all of and I don't know if we ever will always, all of the reasons why,
Mm-hmm.
or see all of the finished story tied together in a bow. But I think that there's something really beautiful about telling your story in process,
Yeah.
where you're going, this is messy, and I don't have the final story, like, oh, and then this happened, so it's great, like that final closing movie scene.
Yeah.
But you're just telling it in process. So I love that you're a person who's doing that. I think it needs to happen more.
Well, it's definitely that's the point in which it's the most alive, if I can say it that way.
Yeah.
Boy, it's coursing through the veins and it's pretty fresh.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
to get that out and in front of others, that's real.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I, for one, will be reading it when it comes out. We ask 2 questions at the end of every Beyond the Bar episode, but I added a third one.
Okay.
For this specific little mini series. We're talking about being legacy builders, specifically about fatherhood, entrepreneurship, and ministry. So one of the questions I wanted to ask on this specific episode is, what would be the biggest piece of advice you would give to men who would either like to be a father someday or already fathers trying to walk that out well?
I would say 2 things. One, relax. I think I've already said that earlier. Relax. And you don't have to go it alone. The Lord can, the Lord's walked this path. I mean, He's the Heavenly Father. And so relax. You're not going to do it perfectly. You're not going to be a perfect husband. You're not going to be a perfect dad or father. And again, don't get your identity tied up with your performance. I would say there's help in being a father and being a husband, and rely on that. Don't try to go it alone. So relax. And then I think the second thing I would say is be a servant. Again, in our culture, the emphasis is me and now.
Yeah.
And what's the return for me? And you have to get beyond that and really get down into rolling up the sleeves. And of course, the illustration in the Bible is Jesus. He takes a towel and he washes the feet of his disciples while they just have been arguing about who's going to be the greatest. And I would say, as a father and as a husband, and really, I think this is how legacies are built. It's built by serving. That's what people are going to remember. That's what people are going to love about you. That's what's going to resonate with them. They know they don't deserve it. But when you're served, when somebody serves you, it's not easily forgotten. It's that thing that was a difference maker. And so I'd say relax and learn to serve. Be a servant.
I love those pieces of advice for men, but I think both obviously could be applicable to women too. I think those are kind of great life pieces of advice. The servanthood one and just relaxing, settling in, and not going it alone are all great pieces of advice. Moving on to our other 2 questions, which again, we close every episode of Beyond the Bar with. They're just the questions I want to know from the people that I sit down and talk to. So it's a 2-part question. First part is, if you could go back and tell your younger self one thing, what would it be? And then the second one, what's one thing you want to be remembered for?
Boy, if I could tell myself one thing. I'm going to sound like a broken record here.
That's okay. People should really get it. And it should nail home.
I would tell myself to relax. I would. I was so high strung, and I don't want to say hard to live with, but at the same time, not easy.
Mm.
It's just, and it's not that you don't have to throw passion out the door for that. You don't have to throw a dream out the door for that. You don't have to pursue something with 110% of your being in that sense. You don't have to do that. But at the same time, don't let that become what you serve. Because if you do, people aren't going to be able to live with you.
Yeah.
They're just, it's not going to be the satisfying life. You're going to chase vanity. So I would say relax. And then what I would want people to remember me for is, I would hope they would remember me for serving. I have never chased the spotlight. That was one of the hardest things about going into the ministry is I did not want to stand up in front of people and say anything. Just give me a vacuum cleaner on a Saturday afternoon and I'll vacuum the sanctuary, right? That's where I wanted to be. And so I would say serve. I would want to be remembered as a servant. That I think has the most return, not just now, but in the future.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, so good. So good. These are why these are my favorite questions. It's just fun to hear what people that I look up to would respond. What would you go tell, your 16-year-old self? If you grab them by the shoulders, what would you say? Super interesting to hear what people respond to that. Which sometimes you could have heard earlier in the episodes, which has happened. And then just that impact piece, like what impact do you really want to be known for? And obviously in today's episode, we were specifically talking about building legacy. And so like you mentioned earlier, I think you're right. One of the biggest ways you do that is by serving others. If you want a legacy left, you have to be thinking about the people that are around you.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for being here. I think you're doing it. And hopefully this episode becomes a part of it, of leaving cool legacy, about having positive impact. So I really appreciate you being on the show. It was really fun to get to chat.
Thank you for having me. I just love this concept of going beyond the bar, getting down into these kinds of conversations that, we all live here, and hearing other people's stories, the hope and the encouragement that comes from that. Thank you for letting me be a part of that.
Thanks. Thank you. Thank you guys for being here to listen. We are going to have the Matt's blog post options, on somewhere on the screen here. So you'll be able to hit the show description, find all of that information that we talked about today in the show, and you can hit that subscribe button if you haven't already, so you can stay tuned for all of our future episodes. We will have a part 2 to this mini series, so Legacy Builders Part 2, talking with another gentleman about family or fatherhood, ministry, and entrepreneurship. So stay tuned for part 2. It's going to be a good one. Thanks, guys.